For more than a decade, Ukraine has waged a global propaganda war to portray itself as a defiant young democracy defending itself against Russian aggression. But over the past couple weeks, this myth has begun to collapse. President Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and other prominent political figures have publicly called out Zelensky as a dictator that cancels elections and silences political dissent. But Ukraine's problem goes much deeper than Zelensky. Since the US-backed color revolution in 2014, Ukraine has become a totalitarian state that not only bans political opposition, but also tortures and kills its members. This is the New Rules podcast, and I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr. Today, we're going to be exposing secret Ukrainian torture prisons where dissidents are beaten, waterboarded, electrocuted, raped, and oftentimes murdered. These prisons are run by Ukraine's infamous secret police, the SBU. For this special investigation, we spoke to survivors and witnesses of these Ukrainian secret prisons. So all the information you'll get in this video comes from firsthand knowledge and personal experience. Before diving into this investigation, we have one small request. Please help us share this video as widely as possible. No one in the mainstream media will touch the topic of Ukrainian secret prisons. So we need your help to raise awareness about these heinous crimes. Our first speaker is Mehdi Feofanovich, an engineer from Kharkov. Before 2014, Mehdi wasn't a particularly political person. However, like many residents of southeastern Ukraine, he was shocked by the Maidan color revolution and subsequent anti-Russian violence. He told us that the last straw for him was the Odessa trade union massacre, when pro-Russia protesters were burned alive by a gang of neo-Nazi thugs. By the way, one of these thugs, Alexei Goncharenko, is now a famous Ukrainian lawmaker. He's constantly quoted by Western media outlets, for example. Shortly after the Odessa trade union fire, Mehdi joined the Russian underground resistance in Kharkov. Many local men wanted to go to the Donbass to help the rebel militias there fight against the Ukrainian regime. Mehdi's job was to help coordinate the logistics of that. However, the Ukrainian secret police were closely monitoring him. In August 2017, Mehdi was arrested by SBU agents and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Mehdi at the time of his arrest was 83 years old, so the SBU wanted to put him in jail until he was 95 years old. Thankfully, he was released at a much earlier date thanks to a prisoner exchange. Let's listen to what Mehdi had to say about his time in SBU prison.
Extremely elaborate forms of torture were used there against me specifically. Everyone was brutally beaten. I provided you with the testimony of one person who ended up in our cell, and I took down his testimony, so to speak. What is this? This is the testimony. What I'm about to tell you is from a man with whom I spent a year and a half in the same cell on the neighboring bunk. His last name is Zverev. He was born in 1955. This year he'll turn 70. He is a professional first responder from the Ministry of Emergency Situations, MCHS. When he was brought into our cell and undressed, we initially thought he was a hardened criminal. His entire torso was blue. We assumed they were tattoos at first, but they weren't. They were bruises from beatings. He was picked up in the Kharkov region in Balaklia, and they started beating him immediately. They would punch and kick him and beat him with sticks, truncheons, and rubber hoses, just mercilessly. When he would lose consciousness, they would splash water on him so he'd regain consciousness. And this would go on, sometimes for days. You know, I don't judge anyone. People who are being beaten, to end this torment, they'd start talking. But even in this vile, Bandera-run Ukraine, only testimonies given in court under protocol are taken into account. If it all happened outside of court, it is disregarded. That is, they consider it. But they cannot put it on record. They really want to look legitimate, as if they're upholding those so-called European values. He told us that he was captured and beaten. They pulverized him. Well, I already mentioned that they kicked and punched him, while striking him with sticks, whatever they could find. They'd perform what is called the swallow technique. This is when they tie a person's hands and feet from behind, pull them together, and then start beating them. But they also have another form of torture. They would sentence a person, they would read out a death sentence, then put a bag over his head and take him somewhere into the woods. The person has no idea where they are being taken. Then they would read the sentence again and start firing shots near their head. This man, Kolya Zverev, didn't break, even though they took him out to be shot numerous times. And they have another method of torture. Prisoners who survived told me about it, and I know it well, as I have studied both the environment and the effects of various factors on the human body. I know that the threshold for noise that a person can endure without severe consequences is 65 decibels. But here's what they do. They take a person. In every cell, the outer door is solid metal, while the inner one is barred. They tape the person to that inner barred door with duct tape, without any support for their legs. Their hands and feet are subsequently bound. Then they put a helmet on them and blast noise at 100 to 120 decibels. It's unbearable torture. People lose consciousness. Some simply die because it is impossible to endure. Prisoners told me they were subjected to this kind of torture in Ukraine. I have seen a lot of things in my life, believe me. I am someone who is well prepared. But to this day, I cannot sit down at a computer and describe what they did to women and girls. It's impossible, do you understand? They are not human beings. These are not human beings.
One of the most shocking revelations that Mehdi told us was about the collusion between Ukrainian SBU and Western NGOs. You know, the same human rights groups that are constantly cited by mainstream media about the situation in Ukraine. As it turns out, these groups are total assets of Ukrainian intelligence. But we'll let Mehdi tell you about that in greater detail.
Pardon me, but Europe believes they are in the right. There is an organization in Europe called Human Rights Watch. It is based in Switzerland. I knew their address. I didn't just write to them, you see. I'll tell you this. I was identifying enemies. Representatives from this Human Rights Watch brought me in to talk to them. The head of the team, Vykintas Ladekis, a Lithuanian whose name I still remember, began asking me the same questions the SBU had posed to me the previous 2 days. I looked him in the eye and replied, "I don't want to talk to you. Please take me back to my cell." He asked, "Why?" I told him, "I don't want to talk to you." They took me back to my cell. I sat down and immediately wrote a message to Human Rights Watch. "Your representative, Vykintas Ladekis, head of the Kharkov group, is working for the SBU. He is not defending human rights, which, according to your own charter, is your duty." I sent the message to their office in Geneva, officially submitting it to the operational unit and to lawyers. I must emphasize this. Prisons have leaks. There are always ways to get in and out. The inmates who were behind bars with me only recognized me. Why? Because I didn't present myself as a spy, despite the accusations against me. They told me, "Hey, old-timer, if you need anything sent out, just give it to us, and we'll get it out there." Everything was sent through 3 channels, officially through lawyers and through prison mail. It reached its destination. Vykintas Ladekis was removed about a month later. Good. And there were a few more like him.
Probably the most elaborate Ukrainian torture center was based in Mariupol. That's where many political prisoners in the Donbass were held. Now, the mainstream media has done everything it can to ignore this story. Instead, they've sought to make Mariupol a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. But in reality, Mariupol was an occupied city from 2014 to 2022. Following the Maidan coup, there was a large popular movement in Mariupol that fought back against the Ukrainian government's efforts to erase their Russian heritage. In response, the Ukrainian government sent tanks in the neo-Nazi Azov battalion to crush peaceful protests. And to consolidate the reign of terror, they reopened old KGB prisons, as well as some new ones. We spoke to Olga Selevskaya, a former leader of the Mariupol resistance who spent 4 months in Ukrainian captivity. Here's what she had to say.
When I was detained, it was almost in the center of the city. They took me to a gypsy settlement on the outskirts of the city and staged a mock execution. After that, they took me to the Mariupol airport, which was called the library. There, they used torture, suffocation, and waterboarding. They asked various questions. Did I know anyone from the militia, and where were the caches in Mariupol located? How could anyone get into the catacombs? I stayed there for about a day. I was kept in a freezer room. Thank God, it was turned off at that time. It was a small room. The lighting was on at the time. I remember the setting. I recall everything that was there. There were scratches on the wall. It was clear that prior to my arrival, they had kept prisoners there, who tried to mark the days of their stay in this room. And there were quite a few of these marks. Later, I was transferred to the basements of the SBU, Ukrainian intelligence. By that time, a case had already been fabricated against me, that I was supposedly coming from Berdyansk with ammo in my bag, and I was supposed to meet a contact. Allegedly, I had a technical passport for a cash-in-transit vehicle from private bank, and this became the reason for my arrest. Although in reality, everything happened quite differently. I was in the SBU basements for 3 days. There were a huge number of people, maybe about 30, maybe even a little more. Everyone was sitting on a cold concrete floor, both men and women. Most of them had signs of torture, bruises on their bodies. Some had large plastic bags tied around their heads, tape around their eyes, and plastic zip ties on their hands. Moving, talking, or even shifting was strictly prohibited. We were guarded by Azov battalion combatants. We were only allowed to go to the bathroom. We could drink water only from a wash basin. During those 3 days, I was taken for interrogations. The interrogations were harsh. In one of the rooms, I was beaten very badly and ended up with a broken rib. It's very painful. It's terrifying to remember everything that happened there. Most of the people who were taken to be interrogated never returned. We can only guess what happened to them if such physical violence was used against them. I was held captive for 120 days. I was periodically taken for interrogations. The place of detention was the Kamensk Pre-Trial Detention Center. During these 4 months, torture was employed, including electric shock. Later, I learned that they would take me to the SBU basements in Mariupol where the electric shock device was. The same place had a rack, and after the city's liberation, when we got into the basement, we saw traces of blood. This electric shocker device used for torture and the rack were there. The entire torture episode was conducted with a sack over my head. I couldn't see where they were taking me. I only sensed the electrodes on my body. Wet rags were then placed on me, and they hooked up a machine. Then something ran through my body. It was extremely painful. My body twisted in agony. It was horrible. They also practiced adding something to a liquid, such as coffee or tea, and when they offered it, they would add a substance that made people more talkative, more willing to talk. The bulk of the torture happened in places like the library. There were several of them in Mariupol, and they were all called libraries, where detainees were brought from the SBU. These places seemed to function below the legal radar, but all the despicable covert work was done by the volunteer battalions. Specifically, in Mariupol, it was the Azov battalion that tortured people to make them more cooperative, so they would implicate themselves and others, such as fellow militia members or those involved in organizing the referendum. Some were at checkpoints, and for some reason they ended up in these situations. This is what happened in Mariupol. There were many such secret prisons in Ukraine. At that time, we were aware of prisons located in Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk, and Kharkov, as well as several others in western Ukraine. In essence, many large cities house these secret facilities where individuals deemed inconvenient to the Kyiv government, those who opposed the regime, were subjected to torture. This included people who wore the St. George ribbon, supported Russia, or had Russian contacts on their phones, as well as those who had communicated with relatives or friends living in Russia,
Another survivor of the secret prisons in Mariupol is Father Feofan, an Orthodox priest who served at a monastery near the city of Ugledar. Following the start of the Donbas War, Feofan began trying to help save civilians from Ukrainian troops. In particular, he alerted civilians about the movement of Ukrainian artillery. In 2015, Feofan was arrested by the SBU and transferred to Mariupol. There, he endured over a month of brutal torture.
Well, when anyone is carted off for torture, they're tortured in the shooting range of this SBU in this temporary facility. The shooting range is a cold, long room, a basement. There is a barrier where the shooters stand and targets with a bullet trap. The space between this barrier and the targets had benches set up like low ones in a gym. They usually seated people there to beat them up and torture them, and so on. Well, they first forced me into a chair and tried to break me psychologically, asking me, "Did you do drugs?" I said, "No." Then one of them told someone, "Bring the black stuff, we're going to inject him." They were watching my reaction, and I thought, well, fine, and now what? Should I descend into panic? Whatever happens, happens. They saw it wasn't working. Well, then my hands were cuffed behind my back with prison cuffs. After that, they moved me to a bench and started hitting me randomly while asking various questions like, "When did you meet the separatists? When did you start helping them?" And all sorts of similar questions. During this ordeal, they assaulted me with electric shockers and struck me everywhere possible with a bat. One time they struck my spine very hard. I had back pain for a long time afterward. It turned out that this wasn't enough for them. They applied water torture. They laid me down on the floor, covered my face with a cloth, and cuffed my hands behind my back. Then they began to pour water on me. During this torture episode, they also placed a low bench, like in a gym, over me. A rather hefty fighter sat on it and pressed down on my legs so I couldn't move at all. That's how I gradually started to drown. Because during this type of torture, water goes into the lungs while air goes into the esophagus. It's a very terrifying sensation. Afterwards, I struggled for a long time to expel the water from my lungs. It was very difficult and extremely painful. I spent a total of 37 days in captivity.
And could you please show me the instruments of torture, if it's not too hard or too dramatic?
It's not hard. Here's a drill bit, 39 centimeters long, 4 millimeters thick. This is the drill bit used to break people's fingers and beat them on the inside of the knee. My cellmate Andrei Sokolov took this drill bit. He hid it in the ventilation. He was there by himself. Andrei ended up there arbitrarily and saw people being beaten with this drill bit. Here it's thinner, but here it widens and is inserted into the drill. That's why they beat people with this side. It's solid like a rock. You can imagine how much pain this inflicted on people during those beatings with this drill. And when Andrei saw all this, he lived in the shooting gallery. He witnessed all these episodes of torture. And one day he just hid it in the ventilation, and I found it when I was able to go there in 2022. In the summer of 2022, I came with journalists to that SBU department where I had been held before. I brought it back because, well, it's an artifact of history now. Then, from a different place, from the airport, from the so-called library, I found a jump rope that was used to beat people. It was indeed in the library, in that very room, in the freezer, and that's where I found it. And, well, who knows, maybe someone got whipped with a jump rope when they were a kid. It's very painful. But when it's done over and over again, and for a long time, it's truly horrific. And here are the handcuffs, possibly the very ones that were used to torture me and other people. You can't escape from them. With regular handcuffs, you can sometimes twist your way out. But here, you see, the two cuffs don't allow for any escape. Moreover, when they are tightened behind your back and someone is laid on the floor, they tighten up even worse. This causes even more terrible, unbearable pain. I also took some surveillance cameras from the armory, from the room where we were held. They were there. Here they are, these cameras. They have seen a lot. These surveillance cameras witnessed how someone was killed there because in that armory there was a large dried bloodstain on the floor. When we were brought there in 2015, they gathered all of us separatists, as they called us. By 2014, many people had already been through there by that time.
The Ukrainians operated with a combination of cruelty and arbitrariness. We spoke to Alexander Machushin, a former Donbass militiaman and war correspondent that is closely familiar with the prisoner exchange process. He told us that often Ukrainian troops took civilians, not fighters, as prisoners. Both civilian and military prisoners were, of course, tortured in barbaric fashion. Here's what he told us about that.
We also managed to get people out again, thanks to some behind-the-scenes agreements, swaps for Ukrainian prisoners of war. By August-September, we had quite a lot of them due to the encirclement of Ilovaisk. That's how we managed to get one girl released. You see, this girl had been gang-raped. When the men were no longer able to rape her, and for natural reasons, they resorted to using objects instead, namely pistols, rifles, anything that they could find. Why was this done? Logically, it makes no sense. Anything she knew, she had already told them. Well, that's because they had beaten her, tortured her, subjected her to unimaginable suffering. This incomprehensible, brutal cruelty permeated nearly all Ukrainian prisons, beginning with the Lukyanivska pretrial detention center. on the very first day after the announcement of the referendum. At some point, their efforts to hunt down people waned. Before the special military operation, during the Minsk agreements period, they were mainly just grabbing people off the streets in order to swap them. While the prisoner swaps were occurring, the Ukrainians frequently traded not only military personnel but also ordinary civilians whom they pulled off the street, slapped separatism charges on, and put up for exchange. Initially, the Ukrainians revived this practice. Later, the SBU Ukrainian intelligence got directly involved. So Ukraine's state security agents and Ukrainian law enforcement joined in as well. While I cannot confirm the current state of affairs, I have heard of alarming several cases. People told me that in Ukraine, many are often presented with a stark choice: either voluntarily enlist with the Ukrainian armed forces or face being labeled an enemy of the state, resulting in imprisonment on charges of treason or similar offenses. And if a person isn't politically active in any way, no one will advocate for their exchange. Also, the existence of torture prisons in Ukraine has enabled the seizure of businesses. Individuals are often labeled as enemies of the state. Their businesses seized and resold, and they end up imprisoned. And since these individuals were not activists or one of ours, they are left to languish in prison, forgotten. It's entirely possible that they could have cared less about Ukraine or Russia. They were simply going about their lives. However, no one will ever advocate for their release, and their relatives won't even be able to contact our authorities. Everything is blocked, so no one can write anywhere. Therefore, a person just vanishes behind bars. But right now in Ukraine, many prisoners, except those convicted of treason, have the option to get out of jail by agreeing to go to the front. Those who find themselves in the torture chambers of Ukrainian nationalists endure a living hell, marked by relentless suffering and torment. And the closer anyone gets to the front line, the more of these torture sites you'll find. In every liberated settlement, there is invariably a torture chamber where people suffered abuse. Before retreating, the perpetrators executed their prisoners to cover their tracks. Take any recently liberated city, for example, Selidov or Skukharkove. I am confident that our fighters will conduct a thorough sweep, complete the demining process, and inspect every building. They will likely uncover a basement where people were tortured and executed before the enemy withdrew. So the Ukrainians would enter a community and would start picking out their informants and intermediaries, people who would drop the dime on others, stating things like, this person wore a St. George ribbon on May 9th. And these individuals organized the referendum. That referendum took place across the Donetsk People's Republic, including in Krasnoarmysk, now Pokrovsk. The referendum ended on May 11th, the same day Ukrainian volunteer battalions entered Donbass. Locals would say, these individuals organized the referendum, attended rallies, and wore St. George ribbons. This is how the Ukrainians compiled their database. They rounded up these individuals and imprisoned them. That scene in the film Sunburn, where a guy sits in a cage at a Ukrainian volunteer battalion base, his legs broken from torture, all because he wore a St. George ribbon. That's not fiction. It happened many times. The horrors I saw in 2014, liberating settlements. The mind blocks out memories like that. I don't even want to talk about it. The sheer brutality was beyond comprehension. They targeted civilians first. Soldiers only ended up captured later, if they were surrounded or if they surrendered out of fear or injury. Yes, there were captured soldiers among our ranks. Some were shell-shocked, some gave up because they saw no point in fighting, some were just scared. It happened. People went to war without realizing what war really was, and they found themselves in captivity. But the Ukrainians primarily built their prisoner exchange pool from civilians, and not everyone among them necessarily supported the Donetsk People's Republic DPR. A local informant working for the Ukrainians might have just been settling personal scores. Someone could have been framed. Once arrested, that person would be sent off to be brutalized. Under torture, they'd say anything to make it stop. They'd admit to supporting the referendum, to personally knowing Putin, to whatever was needed. That's how it worked. Many completely innocent people who never even supported the DPR ended up in those torture chambers because informants exploited the system to settle personal vendettas.
This problem became much worse after the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022. Ukrainian troops adopted a systematic policy of war crimes against Russian POWs. Many of you may have seen videos where Ukrainian troops execute Russian prisoners on camera. But there is also a lot of torture behind the scenes. Olga worked with Russian POWs firsthand, and here's what she had to say.
They became more sophisticated. Not only before the SMO special military operation were they able to burn symbols of the USSR, like the star, on people's bodies, but they also resorted to sexual violence. Later, after the onset of the SMO, I encountered many cases where young Russian boys were castrated. They returned these boys castrated, even according to the testimonies of our guys who participated in the SMO. They talked about prisons where they were sent. They called them concentration camps. In Western Ukraine, individuals who were captured, whether by the Ukrainian armed forces or volunteer battalions, at first experienced a period without physical violence, torture, or mistreatment. However, they are eventually transferred to these concentration camps, which are located in central or western Ukraine. The treatment of the detainees in these facilities is downright horrible. They endure poor conditions and abuse.
The testimonies that we presented today are just the tip of the iceberg. There is enough evidence of Ukrainian war crimes and political repression to fill several thick volumes numbering hundreds of pages each. The Russian people of Ukraine have been through hell for more than 10 years. That's why Putin sent troops into Ukraine back in February 2022. It wasn't about imperial ambitions. It was about stopping a crazed totalitarian state from murdering and torturing its own people. This is why opposing Ukraine is a moral imperative. A regime that rapes and castrates its political opponents shouldn't be receiving hundreds of billions of dollars. And it most certainly shouldn't be receiving high-tech weapons. This is why raising awareness about the true nature of the Ukrainian regime is so important. If you found this video informative, please like and repost it. This will go a long way in helping us to expose the truth about what's really happening in Ukraine. Thank you all for tuning in. Till next time.